All right, this is Chapter 11. Chapter 11 is all about biodiversity. So, our case study is about the Siberian tiger, which has been impacted greatly by overharvesting and habitat loss. Luckily, conservation groups have been working to protect it, and we're going to be watching a documentary about it next week. When we talk about biodiversity, it could be at different levels. The species level is what we talk about the most, but it could also be the genetic level or even at the population and community diversity level. Species diversity can be described as richness, which is the number of species in an area, or evenness, the similarity in the numbers between the species in an area. Speciation adds richness, and extinction reduces it. So take a look at this diagram. The box on the bottom left shows there more species richness in that box because it has more species represented. The box on the right, on the bottom right, is an example of evenness because they're even numbers of the species. Different types of ways to measure biodiversity. Although the term subspecies is controversial among some biologists, a subspecies is defined as populations that have changed over time as compared to the original populations, but not quite enough to be considered different species. When you're writing a scientific name, the subspecies is a third part. So if you ever see a name with 3 parts, that's a subspecies. Genetic biodiversity actually plays a huge role in the study of biodiversity. When a gene pool gets too small, populations risk inbreeding depression, meaning that genetically similar parents might give birth to inferior offspring. This problem is really evident in cheetahs, bison, and elephant seals. Cheetahs used to have a large distribution. They were even found here in North America. The Ice Age wiped out many of them, causing what we call a population bottleneck. What was left behind was a small population that is even a problem for zoo breeding programs. They have a hard time finding cheetahs that they can mate in captivity. On the flip side, all cheetahs are so similar, they could be tissue donors for each other. At a larger scale, we can look at ecosystem diversity. Diversity in an ecosystem depends on different habitats and communities within the ecosystem. Some species groups show more richness than others, especially the insects and specifically the beetles. If you've ever been to the Natural History Museum here at KU, you may have been downstairs in the bug cafe, and do you remember the clear plastic tubes that went up into the ceiling? They're full of little plastic animals representing the diversity of various animal groups, and the insect tube went all the way up into the ceiling to represent how many insects there are relative to other species. Here's another great visualization showing the diversity of species and highlighting how insects basically rule the world. They're shown here in blue, representing 72.7% of all animals. If we pull out just the vertebrates, we can see that fish rule. They dominate with 48%. We don't know exactly how many species there are on Earth. Estimates have ranged wildly between 3 and 100 million species. We know that over 1 million have been identified and described. In a famous experiment shown here at the bottom, a biologist named Terry Irwin sprayed pesticide into one tree in the Amazon and then counted how many dead things fell out of the tree. Based on this number, he extrapolated that there are probably 30 million species on Earth. Most scientists think that he overestimated, and now they settle on a number more close to 3 to 9 million species. Biodiversity is not evenly distributed around the world. Richness increases as you move toward the equator. We call this a latitudinal gradient. Latitudinal gradient makes sense if you think about how the weather close to the equator is pretty stable year-round, and there are many diverse habitats. When we talk about the loss of biodiversity, we can use 2 different terms. We can say extinction if we mean the loss of the entire species, or extirpation if we're talking about the loss from one area. For example, we have birds that used to live in Kansas called the black-capped vireo, and now they're just small populations in Oklahoma and Texas. So we would say that the black-capped vireo was extirpated from Kansas. Once again, we have seen 5 natural mass extinctions in our Earth's history, but the one that we're experiencing now, the 6th extinction, is because of human impacts. We know that the background rate of extinction is much lower than what we're actually witnessing now. Some of the species that have gone extinct because of humans include the dodo bird, the Carolina parakeet, which was once right here in Kansas. In fact, they have specimens of it up at the Natural History Museum, and the passenger pigeon. Others are near extinction, including the whooping crane, shown in the bottom middle. This bird spends its winters in Texas at a place called Aransas Pass Wildlife Refuge. One of my friends grew up there, and she took me birding one day, and I saw 10% of the world's population because there are only 150 in the world at the time. This condor pic on the bottom is really important to me. The condor population, California condor population, got so small that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the San Diego Zoo got permission to round up and capture every single bird in captivity in the wild, and to put them into captivity to feed them and to raise them and to produce more chicks to release into the wild. I had a really special teacher experience a few years ago when I was invited to be a part of a conservation workshop at the San Diego Zoo. The California condor population, like I mentioned, got so small, it dwindled down to 22 individuals in 1982. And when they started the breeding program, they became the first, I believe the California condor, when they released one and it bred in the wild, it was the first time one had been seen in San Diego in over 100 years. The picture of the puppet in the upper left-hand corner shows the chick being fed. And a cool story behind this, they really love teachers at the San Diego Zoo, and they really get them into their programs and their workshops to educate them. And it was actually a teacher who came up with this idea of creating a little puppet to feed these chicks so that they don't imprint on humans. In the picture on the bottom right, I'm holding a California condor feather. There are 6 main factors that contribute to the loss of biodiversity. Be sure and add these to your notes because your book leaves one out. And they are Chippo. That's the way we remember it. Chippo the hippo. That's our little APES mascot. Chippo stands for climate change, habitat alteration, invasive species, pollution, population, meaning overpopulation by people, and over-harvesting. So pause the video and add those to your notes, maybe even draw a cute little Chippo hippo to help you remember. Habitat loss is the biggest contributing factor to the loss of biodiversity. This may come from destruction of the habitat, fragmentation, or degradation. Fragmentation has been a huge issue for wildlife. It has a big impact, especially on larger species that need larger contiguous stretches of habitat. And as we talked about in Chapter 5, landscape ecologists often look at ways to connect the patches of landscape fragments to optimize which ones to preserve. If you follow our APES Instagram, I posted this this picture this week, and I think it's a good reminder that even something as seemingly harmless as a road can be really destructive in terms of habitat alteration. If you love to read, this is a book that I really recommend. It's a story of the impact of habitat fragmentation on the Denver, Colorado area and Boulder area as well. This book talks about how large species, such as mountain lions, have become a concern to the residential communities because they keep carving up the habitat. And so the mountain lions have become sort of integrated into the community, which scares a lot of the residents. Here's a satellite image looking at habitat fragmentation in California. Conservationists are looking for ways to build corridors connecting these fragments together to allow for the large home range movement of something large like a mountain lion. We must pause here for a moment to mourn the loss of our native biome, the tallgrass prairie, which falls under the category temperate grassland. It has suffered more destruction than any other global biome, leading to the loss of so many species. And I'm sad to tell you that in a normal year, we'd be visiting the Kanza Prairie in Manhattan next week. This is our pick of the 2019 APES. It says 2020, it should say 2019, my apologies. I am happy to tell you, however, that the hiking trails at Kanza are open, and I'm really happy to give you details about how to go, how to visit with your friends and family. And if you go, you have to visit Varsity Donuts downtown Manhattan because it's amazing. Pollution of all sorts impacts biodiversity, especially air and water pollution. You already know about overharvesting after watching Racing Extinction. It's really sad and incredible that we've lost 90% of the large animals in the ocean to overharvesting. Invasive species have had many effects on native species, including as their predators, competitors, and even parasites. Climate change has caused many species to shift their geographic ranges. If they can't adapt, they'll die. So we might be losing 20 to 30% of species as the climate changes. This graphic shows some of the range shifts that have already been quite dramatic. And one I wanted to point out on the right is the armadillo, which we have watched creep into Douglas County. I see them every year now, and we are sort of the northernmost part of their range expansion. Another species that I have personally witnessed in the past few years on the move is this beautiful bird called the painted bunting. I grew up with these amazing birds in central Texas, but they only started showing up in Douglas County regularly in the past 10 years or so. I'm an avid trail runner, and I run a lot of the trails at Clinton Lake, which is prime habitat for them. And just over the 5 years I've been noticing them, I started seeing 2 pairs. In last summer, I probably saw 15 to 20 pairs in the same area. So, hey, that's a win for us. We like to have the painted bunting here. One reason to protect biodiversity is because of the many ecosystem services that we get from these different organisms. These services are often irreplaceable, even though economists may try to put a dollar value on them. Biodiversity also just helps keep our ecosystems functioning. We already know about how the loss of a keystone species can have devastating effects on the ecosystem, but sometimes we never know what the loss of even one tiny little species might cause. I love this quote from Aldo Leopold, preservationist: "To keep every cog and wheel is the first precaution of intelligent tinkering." We also get food security from biodiversity. There are new food sources being tapped all the time from nature. We'll talk about some of them when we get to our agriculture unit. These are a few of the species that have been identified as potentially being new crop sources for us. Those are amaranth cookies, by the way. I tried them. They're not great. We can also find cures and medicine in nature. For example, Taxol is a cancer-fighting drug that my own mother has taken as a cancer survivor. Some species have gone extinct before we could even tap into the potential resources they could have provided. These are 2 of my favorite unusual sources of medicine from nature. The horseshoe crab has blue blood that is harvested. The crabs are not harmed, they're put back in the ocean, but their blood is used to test drugs. The black mamba is one of the most deadly venomous snakes, but it provides us with pain medication. Biodiversity can lead to ecotourism, another economic benefit. And, we just get a lot of value out of nature. This is a great term that was coined by E.O. Wilson, biophilia. E.O. Wilson is considered the father of biodiversity, and he says that we all have a natural love inside of us of living organisms. The second term, nature deficit disorder, is the idea that many of our personal and societal problems might be rooted in our disconnect with nature. And this book is another great book that I highly recommend. Richard Louv grew up in Kansas City, and I've gotten to hear him speak twice, and he is amazing. This is one of my favorite quotes as a science educator. In the end, we will conserve only what we love, we will love only what we understand, and we will understand only what we are taught. And by the way, if you know my kid, that's him holding the monarch butterfly on the bottom left, Logan. If you have a passion for preserving biodiversity, conservation biology might be a field that you would want to look into. Some conservation biologists specialize in genetics, looking at the minimum viable population size, or how small a population can get before it's too small, which is what they did with the condors. All right, for apes, there are 10 laws that you need to learn. And the first one, and one of the most important ones, is the Endangered Species Act from 1973, often called ESA. This is a national law that was written with the goal to prevent extinction. This has been one of the most successful environmental laws, as 99% of the species that have been listed have moved toward recovery. The bald eagle is probably the most famous example of a species that has recovered and has been taken off the list. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife are the primary group that enforce this law. The second law that you need to know for apes is CITES, which is an international law coming out of the United Nations group. It protects endangered species by requiring special permits for transporting protected animals or their body parts out of a country. Make sure you know those two laws, highlight them, underline them, or whatever in your notes to make sure that you understand that they are the two most important laws from this unit. So let's look at some of the solutions to protecting biodiversity outside of legislation. Captive breeding is one solution, or reintroductions, which we've already talked about. Zoos can play a huge role in both of these. The story of the Yellowstone wolves has been all over the news, the reintroduction. Cloning is a potential solution. It's not highly viable yet, but maybe in the future it will be. Forensic science can be used to track illegal animal trading. We saw that in Racing Extinction. And a couple of terms that come from conservation biology that you need to know. Umbrella species is a species that, when protected, many other species are saved along with it under its umbrella. These are usually large dynamic animals such as elephants and tigers. In the diagram up above, you can see that it's the spotted owl. And another term is flagship species. These are species that usually help raise money or incentivize people to do the right thing, such as the cute panda on the World Wildlife Fund logo. Nobody really wants to donate money to save a tardigrade or a slug, so sometimes you need a flagship species to do the trick. One more solution would be protecting parks and lands. This will help protect biodiversity if they are properly managed. Biodiversity hotspots are areas around the world that have been identified as at risk for losing their high biodiversity. And you can see some of them here. Ecological restoration is one more solution. If we restore the land, we may be protecting it and restoring the species that once lived there. The Baker Wetlands is a great example of a local restoration effort after the building of the very controversial Lawrence Trafficway. And that's the end of our biodiversity chapter, chapter 11. We will watch some of the Siberian tiger conservation movie next week, and you'll get to see what it's like being a conservation biologist in the field.